Good afternoon, ministers, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Joel Stringer and I'm the General Manager for the Lendlease building business in New South Wales. Lendlease is privileged to be a sponsor for BOOMTOWN. We're committed to providing the community of Western Sydney with the best places to work, live and play. As a Dutch immigrant, the founder of Lendlease, Dick Dusseldorp, bought 166 acres of agricultural land in Campbelltown in 1958. His vision was to create a new type of residential community, and one of the first things he did was invest in local transport infrastructure, funding and building a new train station at Campbelltown that was completed in 1965. Our proud history in Western Sydney has spanned a further 50 years and has included major projects such as Bankstown Square in the 60s, Penrith Plaza in the 70s, the original Parramatta Stadium in the 80s, and then the current tranche of projects including the new Western Sydney Stadium, our Jordan Springs community, and the North Connects project. These projects are a great opportunity to continue our strong relationships with local industry, to create training opportunities and jobs through the engagement with local subcontractors and suppliers. We understand the importance of true local participation as we are demonstrating on the new Western Sydney Stadium with 100% of the structural steel being fabricated by Western Sydney suppliers. In fact, 43% of Lendlease's New South Wales employees live in Western Sydney. We're expanding our Parramatta office and have invested in a manufacturing facility in Eastern Creek, where our design make business is leading the Australian market in engineered timber buildings. Lendlease shares its excitement about the opportunities in Western Sydney with our government partners. We have a shared vision and we're helping to translate that into reality through delivering on these critical projects. We're committed to the government's vision for long-term growth and shift of Sydney's population towards the west and creation of opportunities to grow Sydney's economy in new and emerging sectors. At Lendlease, we believe success comes from a partnership approach, an approach where everyone buys into the vision of what's being created. I'd now like to share some credentials of our next guest, the Honorary Anthony Albanese, Federal Minister for the Sydney seat of Grayndler since 1996, and current Shadow Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Cities, Regional Development, and Shadow Minister for Tourism. Anthony was also the Deputy Prime Minister to Kevin Rudd in 2013. He was Australia's first Infrastructure Minister and brought the Commonwealth back into the planning and funding of projects to make our cities more sustainable, productive, and better places to live. Anthony established Infrastructure Australia, our first independent institution to assess infrastructure projects. I hear he's also a sponsor of infrastructure big and small, whether it be major airports or sheds in Somerville. And with that, I invite John Stanley and Honourable Anthony Albanese MP to the lectern to hear Anthony's vision for the Greater Western Sydney.
Can you hear us? Yes, you can. And I should just a declaration on one of his constituents in the seat of Grayndler. So, politicking, every vote counts.
Be nice, or you'll get a rezoning.
And this is a man who's he started out as a left-wing firebrand. He now represents the seat of Balmain. So whether that means you're pitching for the Tory vote or the Green vote, I'm not sure. But we mentioned Infrastructure Australia there, and when you were there in 2007, you got into government. One of the first things you did was outline the vision of getting back into infrastructure, getting things happening, particularly in our cities. We know what intervened in the intervening time. We had the GFC, change of government. So 10 years on, as you look at Western Sydney in particular, what would you say, as it stands, how many of those goals were met and where have we fallen short?
I think the Infrastructure Australia model has proven itself to be right. The big challenge in infrastructure, I think, is pretty simple. How do you break the nexus that's there between the infrastructure investment cycle, which by definition is long-term, and the political cycle, which is increasingly very much short-term. So the big challenge is to depoliticise it. And I think the Infrastructure Australia model that says that the dollars should follow productivity and proper planning is the right way to go, absolutely. And to have that long-term approach, that's the big challenge. Immediately, if you're sitting around a cabinet table and there's a finite amount of funds available, and the person across from you says, if I give $100 to everyone tomorrow, then there'll be an immediate political bonus. And you're arguing, if I get all of that accumulated money, put it into a project, some future government and some minister unknown is going to get to open it, then that's a hard argument. And the truth is that human beings are around the cabinet table, and they make those decisions, and they make them often on a political basis. But I think fundamentally it was absolutely right. It was opposed when we did it. The legislation didn't just sail through. But the fact that the current government has kept Infrastructure Australia, and the debate is over how do you strengthen it, really, rather than whether it'll continue to exist or not, is a very good thing. It's a model that has been replicated with Infrastructure New South Wales, similar bodies in Victoria, Queensland, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, all around the world. It's seen as best practice.
Talk about politics there and change. So one of the things that frightens people in this room is the idea suddenly everything's going to change. And we know, thanks to our founding fathers, that could happen any day. So if you were back as...
It's happened during the last session we lost the senator.
Well, that's right. So if you suddenly find a new minister, and if you became infrastructure minister, you'd be in a situation where you had that history, you knew the job. But there have been instances, haven't there, where new ministers come in and people think, well, this is the pet project that I couldn't get past Albo, I'm going to try and get it past he or she. How often does that happen?
Oh, look, it happens every time, every single time. When I was appointed, I wasn't the Shadow Minister for Transport. I was the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure and Water in 2007 at the time of the election. Before that, I'd had a range of portfolios, including the environment, climate change, employment, a range of things. But I wasn't the Transport Minister. So what happens when any government comes in, as well, is shock horror. The government of the day finds out that the government of yesterday, the books weren't as good as they said it were. Shock horror, we need a mini budget and we need to make cuts. That happens every time. One of the things that they was on the table in December 2007 as a cut stroke saving was, how about there's this parcel of land in southwestern Sydney that we can sell and we can get money for it and we can have housing. And the Herald wrote articles about lifting the controls that were there, opening it all up. It's called Badgerys Creek. That was there. And I had to resist my first battle I had as the Minister for Infrastructure, bear in mind that the Labor Party platform said Labor will not build an airport at Badgerys Creek at that time, was to say, oh no, I think we should just leave it there. And that was, it's worth billions of dollars, that land.
How do you fight that? Is it within your party? Is it with the public servants?
Within the party. It matters whether you have weight or not in the party. That's the truth. I was the leader of the House of Representatives. So I found being the leader of the House quite useful. It's amazing how compliant your colleagues are when they have their own priorities they want to get listed in Parliament. And it can be listed today or maybe in 2035, depending upon the mood of the Leader of the House. I found I never had a problem getting my legislation listed immediately. The IA legislation was the second one that we did. On the second day of sitting, we introduced it. Basically straight after the apology we did on day one, that's what we did on day two. So you have things like that inevitably you'll get, they'll come from the bottom drawer. Another one is there was this program for seatbelts on school buses. And every time Finance would try and knock it off in the ERC and you'd get this, and every time I'd go along and I'd say, if there's one bus crash with school kids in it, do you really think it's the politics is sustainable that you're abolishing this $2 million a year program. And it was never spent because it was the demand wasn't there, but you'd get a couple of applications each year from kids in little country schools. And the government, in its first budget in 2014, the incoming government, they didn't see it, they didn't knock it back, and it went through. And I remember saying to Warren Truss, mate, a very brave decision. And, you know, he hadn't sort of paid attention to it. So sometimes it's the little things as well that are really important. There mightn't be a lot of politics in it. The remote area airport scheme as well, which basically fixes up. We're not even talking about concrete runways, we're talking about dirt runways in remote areas that are vital, particularly in Indigenous communities. You know, that was something that every year as well they tried to abolish it. And I used to get through that by walking in. Jenny Macklin was always on the ERC. She was the Aboriginal Affairs Minister. And I used to say, this is the Save Jenny Macklin's Life Fund. We want Jenny flying in, as well as the people who live in these communities, and we just fix it. But there's always a bottom drawer of savings or cuts that someone in the bureaucracy wants, and occasionally they slip through.
Your phone's obviously ringing a bit more these days because you're obviously closer to being...
I'm very popular these days.
Yeah, I can imagine. So you get back in, the situation's a lot different to 2007, there isn't the money there, so what can you do?
You can prioritise, and part of the priority has to be that infrastructure is not seen as a cost, it's seen as an investment that produces a return. If you pick the right projects, it doesn't cost the budget long term. It actually increases revenue to government, and you have to have that approach, and you've got to fight the fight on it. It was a good time to be the infrastructure minister in terms of the global stimulus plan that we had. I remember Mike Murdoch was here earlier, I remember coming out of a cabinet meeting during that period and him saying, we went into it, we had 17 rail projects that were ready to go and 14 road projects that were ready to go. There should have been more. Frankly, if state governments had done better planning of all political persuasions, then you could have done more and you wouldn't have needed to do some of the other things we had to do to keep the economy going. And I came out and he said, which ones were approved? Because it didn't take that long. And I said, all of them. Literally all of them. And on top of that, we did 5,500 community infrastructure projects as well, many of them right around Western Sydney.
Can you do more now? Like if you get in, is the money there?
You can do more. Well, you need to find the money. You need to find the money for the right projects. And I think it is. I think the consequences of you've got to win the debate. And when I say you've got to win the debate, I mean you've got to win the debate here too, as well, in terms of the sector. And I think the business community, quite frankly, are too polite in this country about issues like infrastructure cuts. Over the next decade, the Parliamentary Budget Office estimates that infrastructure investment will go from 0.4% of GDP to 0.2%. That will have a devastating impact on economic growth and jobs in this country. It's completely unacceptable. Over the forwards, we've seen in the first three budgets of the current government, there's a $3.9 billion underspend. That is not our figures, their own figures in the budget. If you look at in 16-17, for example, in the budget it said there'd be $9.2 billion spent. The actual was 7.5, a $1.7 billion underspend. Now, if Duncan Gay's here, there's a few people who've been in charge of these things. If the money wasn't being done on the Pacific Highway because they'd found a green and golden bellfrog or something or other, then you put it out, you find something else that's ready to go, and that's what you do. Indeed, I recall a phone call to Duncan when he was the minister and said, mate, I need you to have some more money from the Pack Highway, because if that didn't happen, Finance and Treasury never give it back. And it's too hard to fight for an infrastructure budget to give anything back. So it certainly never happened while I was the Minister. And I think that's a problem. It declines. If you look at the forward estimates, in 2020-21, it's 4.2 billion. So it's from 9.2 to 4.2. It's like dropping off a cliff. And replacing that is the current rhetoric about value capture and, innovative financing and all these sort of sexy sort of postmodernist words that really mean cuts. That really means the government is winding back its commitment to infrastructure. And, that's a fight that has to be fought. It's got to be fought in the Labor Party as well and fought in the coalition. And the business community, in my view, should be less passive about those issues.
Because you mentioned environmental issues, the Greens are attacking you from one side, and you've got on the extreme right, they both argue against population growth, and certainly in the media, Talkback Radio, people are always asking the question, is the argument for a big population growth and the continuing the so-called big Australia, is that being put strongly enough?
No, it's not, and I think we've all of us have to accept some responsibility for that. The key is infrastructure. If people see their quality of life declining, they'll rebel. And what people in the Greens or in One Nation do is come up with simplistic slogans rather than real, actual solutions. And for the Greens and One Nation, I mean, there's a lot of similarities in terms of stop the world, I want to get off. But the truth is that we have to argue the case, but we also have to demonstrate. And Western Sydney, the Badgerys Creek site should be seen as a catalyst for development. It's not just about a runway and a terminal, it's about what happens with the science park that Celestino are doing there. What's happening with all the development up and down that corridor. And if that happens, what you'll see is a massive increase. There's a potential for a massive increase in the living standards of people, of having you need public transport, and that's why the North-South Rail Link is absolutely critical, down to the Macarthur region, up to St Mary's, up to Rouse Hill, connecting people with those jobs, connecting people with the STEM school that's going to be there, K-12, has to be seen as an enormous opportunity to get it right. The problem we've had in the past is that often suburbs have been built and then people think, how are they going to get there? What are the schools and hospitals going to be? If you do it right, and the regional rail link in outer Melbourne is a great example of doing it right, where places like Wyndham Vale and Tarneet, the train stations are there, the suburbs are being built around them. That is how it should happen. But too often in the past, that's been a mistake. And the other mistake that's happening a little bit, I think, potentially in Sydney, around Sydenham to Bankstown, for example, is a massive increase in, I support increased density along railway lines, but for goodness sake, you can't do things like turn Canterbury Racecourse into housing without thinking about where are the kids going to play, where are they going to go to school, where are they going to go to hospital. And I say this to developers in the room. If you don't think that there's a riot coming over tolls, over overdevelopment, over lack of community infrastructure, then, sometimes greed catches up with you. And those issues, social infrastructure and the quality of life, you can have, ironically, you need higher density, and this is where the Greens are sort of wrong in opposing. They oppose all sort of development. You need higher density in order to make public transport work. But if you have all the density that's happening, take Woolli Creek's just the other side of my boundary. I don't know where kids are going to play around Woolli Creek because there's just more and more high-rise with not a single new bloody oval, and it drives me nuts. And what will happen what will happen is social dislocation and a revolt. And that will advantage the Greens, frankly, who want no development. Whereas if you have quality development that builds in the social infrastructure, whether it be in the new developments around Western Sydney, that has to be about open space. It has to be about places for... I mean, I can't stand the fact in our area, as I can say that, in the inner west, every oval where kids play footy, the Greens want to turn into passive space so they can fly kites and stuff. It drives me nuts. We need spaces for people, places for kids, places for families. And the private sector have a responsibility as well as the government to make sure that that happens. And that's how you win the population debate. People, the reason why people come to cities is because they're dynamic and because you can go in this great city. You can see Paul Kelly down the road here at the Opera House on a Sunday night. You can do all the things that bring cities together. But it's got to be about livability and sustainability, and it can either be the hard way or the easy way. The easy way is to get the planning right. The hard way is to wait till there's pushback.
But we're over time, but I just want to ask you, because what you just said, you talked about population growth and then you talked about developers. The developers would argue that they're just trying to keep up with the number of people that are looking for housing.
Sure, and it's a matter, though, of ensuring that that consideration is given, and this is where the government has to do it. The government has to have policies in place whereby there's appropriate development and quality development. I had examples. There's a development right on Marrickville train station that was opposed by the local community. I supported it, backed it in. I support good quality development. I support increases in density, but I don't support a free-for-all. And there's a fine line between that and one proposal that's out there at the moment, for example, of 28-storey towers on a floodplain where there's currently no houses in that area above 2 stories. Like that's just silly. It's just silly, and people will react to it if things like that happen. So it's a matter of getting the balance right and getting the opportunity for quality. I mean, I've seen the plans for the Science Park, for example, which is 10,000 residences. It's quality. There's space that's been built in. There's recreational space. There's space for cinemas and for all of that activity. That is good quality development.
All right. Anthony Albanese, thank you very much. People have taken notes. They'll be holding you to account if you take the job. Thank you so much.